Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm going to show you how to do an interlock bind off for knit one, purl one ribbing in the round. And I'm using this method to bind off my free climber socks. The interlock bind off is a sewn bind off. It's a little slower to do than other bind off techniques, but it gives you a really nice stretchy finish to your knitting that doesn't flare out. So it can be well worth the time. Let's get started. After knitting the cuff of my sock, I cut my yarn and left a nice long tail to work with, and I've threaded that tail onto a yarn needle. Since I'm working in the round, I need to do just a little bit of setup here before I begin binding off to minimize any gapping that could happen here between the last stitch of the round and the first stitch of the round. Since this first stitch of my round is a knit, I am going to bring my yarn tail through purlwise from the back to the front. Just make sure things don't get twisted up here around the needles as I'm working. And then I am also going to bring my yarn purlwise through the very last stitch that I just worked. Again, from the back to the front. And again, making sure I don't get tangled up on anything. Then I can pull this back needle through so I can start binding off. Now we're going to look at our work, and again, this first stitch is a knit and it's followed by a purl because I'm doing knit one, purl one ribbing. So I'm going to bring my yarn through the first stitch knitwise and drop it off, and then knitwise again through the second stitch, leaving the stitch on my needle, and I'm going to pull the tail almost all the way through. And you can see I'm left with this loop here. Right now my yarn tail is at the back of my work, so I'm going to bring it through this loop from the back to the front and then pull it through and tighten everything up. My next stitch is a purl, so I'm going to bring the yarn needle purlwise through the first stitch and drop it off, purlwise through the second stitch and leave it on, pull the yarn through, leaving a little loop, and sometimes I just like to use my finger there just to make sure that that loop doesn't close up. My yarn tail is at the front of my work, so I am going to bring it through that loop from the front to the back, and then tighten things up. The next stitch is a knit, so I'm going to bring the yarn knitwise through the first stitch and drop it off, knitwise through the second stitch, leaving it on, pull it through, again making this little loop. My yarn is at the back of my work, so I'm going to bring it through the loop from the back to the front and tighten things up. And then just one more. My next stitch is a purl, so I'm going to bring the needle purlwise through the first stitch and drop it off, purlwise through the next stitch, leave it on, pull the yarn, make my loop. Since my yarn is at the front, I'm going to bring it through from front to back through that loop and then tighten things up. And you just continue on all the way around your knitting to bind off all your stitches until you get to the last two stitches. I'm almost done binding off my stitches. I have 2 stitches remaining here on my left needle, and you can see the first one's a knit and the second one is a purl. So just like we've been doing, I'm going to bring my yarn needle knitwise through the first stitch and drop it off, knitwise through the second stitch, and I'm also going to drop that stitch off of my needles, and I can set my knitting needles aside then. I'm going to pull the yarn almost all the way through so that I get that loop. Since my yarn is at the back, I'm going to bring it through the loop from the back to the front and then tighten things up. And you can see I still have a little bit of a gap here in between the last stitch I bound off and the first one. So I need to close that up, and I'm going to zoom in here so we can take a close look at what's happening. The first stitch that I bound off was here at the top of this column of knits. Since my yarn is at the front, I'm going to bring it through this first stitch at the top of the knit column from the front to the back and just pull it through to kind of close up that gap and minimize it. But you'll notice if I apply any sort of pressure to this, that last little join stretches out. And you don't want that to happen while you're wearing your sock. So somehow you need to anchor this yarn a little bit before weaving it in on the wrong side of your work and finishing off your sock. And the way I like to anchor it is just bringing it, and let me see how close I can bring it in. I'm going to bring my yarn forward from the back to the front here, right kind of on the side of that knit column, that first knit column, and bring it through. And then back down where that first knit at the top of the column goes down from the front to the back. And it's kind of like duplicate stitch. You're kind of trying to follow your knitting as much as you can so that it blends into your work. So now when you stretch here, that isn't going to stretch all out. It'll stay anchored. And now you can weave your yarn tail, the remaining yarn tail, back down through the wrong side of your work. So I hope that you have enjoyed learning how to do the interlock bind off. And if you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!